Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a privilege and an honor to have been invited and to speak to such a distinguished audience. The last 4 days during this conference have been of immense value because this is a very rare encounter of experts, practitioners, and academics all involved in the field of migration. So without any further ado, let me just introduce to the brief topic, to the topic that I'm going to discuss, which is smart cities and migration. There were some slides, but they're irrelevant at this point. So yesterday we were talking about migration and technology and the connection between these two. In particular, we looked at this macro dimension of the connection, looking at how migrants are accounted for, identified, and how the admission process proceeds. In this context, we talk about biometrics, etc. But there was also a very interesting discussion on what's the role of social media in portraying or accounting for migration. And the hint was that, well, unfortunately, because of the accessibility of social media and in an era that everyone can be editor of news, migration has been instrumentalized to the disadvantage of those who would very much need our support. So the purpose of my presentation today is to have a slightly different view on the issue, because I'm going to look at the connection between cities and more particular smart cities and migration. So everyone knows that smart cities as such is a hot topic, not less is migration, but surprisingly the connection between these two, that is smart cities and migration, remains relatively under-discussed. So in my discussion, which will consist of just additional 4 steps, I'm going to highlight the connection and see what is there in there for us as policymakers, academics, or also civil society members. So clearly, we all know that the preponderant part of migrants globally, be it in the global north or south, they basically flock in cities. So depending on the specific case, but it's about 60 up to 80% of all migrants, they go to the cities because cities offer the imagined opportunities, or real at times as well. So this suggests that the pressures are basically located in the city and urban space. If current trends continue, then by the year 2050, the number of migrants globally will be close to 500 million. So if we just try to connect the dots, the connection between migration and cities is one of the most important ones. So in short, cities, rather than national authorities, are the ones who bear the burden and the challenge of addressing and mitigating challenges and possibly opportunities that migration inflicts. So I would like to look at this issue from 3 perspectives. First, when you look at the city space and what the city authorities have to do, you definitely deal with the issue of management of regular and irregular entries. So this is very much a legal dimension where you need to have a very good collaboration between the national level authorities and local city authorities. But there is also a very important issue related to space scarcity and resource scarcity. So we cannot make cities expand in several cases, so the question is how the authorities deal with it. Then we have the resultant challenges such as health and sanitation, epidemics, shelter, safety, integration of the incoming population, but we cannot forget also about the receiving population, considering that we have several constraints. So what is the second perspective I would like to emphasize? Well, cities lack resources. Cities lack the necessary support from national governments frequently, again, cities develop their expertise ad hoc. Very rarely we have cities that develop resilience strategies, but there are several very good examples that cities actually do it. So as a result, migration is not necessarily a factor that is included in resilience strategies if they are developed in the first place. And the third point that I would like to emphasize is that the role of cities in the global value chain is bound to increase, and therefore in the years to come it will be cities rather than national economies that will be competing with each other. So if you try to put these points A, B, and C together, then clearly we cannot deny that the connection between cities and migration is one of the most important ones that we should be looking at these days. So the point number 3 of my discussion is, so what is the connection between smart city and migration? So as you well know, the key focus point of the discussion on smart cities is how and to what extent sophisticated information and communication technology can facilitate the functioning of a city space in terms of a city's ability to withstand, preempt, or address challenges and risks and threats as they emerge. So seen in this way, smart cities research essentially deals with questions such as governance, mobility, economy, including new forms of economic collaboration, energy, living conditions, including also architecture and architectural design. Finally, there's also the issue of environment. So seen in this way, smart cities research, and increasingly so also smart city-oriented policy making, is very much related to these spheres. So the big question is, what is the value added of smart cities, seen in this way, and in particular the value added of ICT, when cities encounter the challenge of migration? So what is the promise that ICT holds? And I still have 5 minutes, so I'm just fine. So migrants, as we all know, as they first arrive, and let's say the city of Athens, where I'm based, is one of the very illustrative examples. They need to have shelter. We need to make sure that their health is also considered. There is the big issue of epidemics, the question of sanitation, safety, access to information, communication. We also need to make sure that they are physically well and that the psychology is also up, because otherwise what can happen? So many people talk about integration, but I think the big question really is, how do we make sure that the migrants, as they arrive, they actually are given a degree of normalcy so that they can look forward with a hope? So now, what about smart cities in this context? We already said, well, pretty much it is about the encounter of ICT and such processes and issues as governance, mobility, economy, energy, living conditions, architecture, and environment. So in which ways ICT can be useful to facilitate the transition of migrants into citizens? So there are several solutions that have been proposed, starting from wearables, through access to libraries, through monitoring facilities, access to databases, applications allowing migrants to get information about who and how, and so avoid falling into new networks of traffickers, etc. So if you only wish, we could discuss it in great detail. But I also want to talk about the premise and some issues that we have to be aware of it. So yesterday, when we talk about technology, one of the arguments was that, well, maybe technology is not such a good thing. I'm a fervent supporter of technology, but whenever we do that, we always have to remember that we have to be very sensitive to social and ethical considerations. And then there's also the legal dimension that follows. So there are very serious issues of privacy, breaches to privacy. There is also the very thin line of how much of surveillance and monitoring and privacy again. So there are those spheres that we need to address if we want to really exploit the promise of ICT in context of smart city or in context of city and migration. So what are the takeaways? Cities are definitely the key actors in the process of managing migration, and their role is bound to increase in that process. Cities are engaged with the macro and micro, that is agency-related, day-to-day management of migration, and no one can deny that, and yet there isn't enough of consideration given to the role cities play in that process. So considering issues of scarcity in city space, including again space, funding and other resources, planning is necessary. So the connection in this context between the receiving and incoming population has to be taken very seriously. The several cases from Europe suggest that because of lack consideration of, being given to this issue, results or basically fuels populism, etc., etc. ICT, it's number 4, and so the focus on the promise of smart city bears great advantage and great potential, and it ought to be discussed. And therefore, number 5, relevant policy making is mandatory. That is, considering the very existence of ICT and considering also both the promise and the challenges that it may create. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for 10 minutes.